Europe stirred on the 1st of September, 1939, to the rumble of armour traversing the Polish boundary. In under 2 years, the swastika banner waved from the Atlantic to the thresholds of Moscow. No military in modern annals had progressed so far, so quickly. France collapsed in 6 weeks, Norway within 1 month, Yugoslavia in 11 days. London was ablaze, Kiev faced siege, and the coalition was falling back on every axis. Yet behind the flash of the lightning war, its constraints were already appearing. An empire held by velocity, terror, and a system that could not endure the trial of duration. Primary dominance, the legend of the lightning strike. By daybreak on the 1st of September 1939, Poland's frontier trembled under a synchronized strike unique to contemporary chronicles. Armored units traversed the boundary accompanied by Stuka aircraft, which dived with clinical accuracy. Mechanized formations moved 50 kilometers daily, whereas local riders tried opposing them via obsolete tactics. Nazi transmissions functioned through wireless sets instantly. Leaders obtained commands straight from forward positions, modifying their movement with agility foreign to the coalition. In 2 weeks, Warsaw faced isolation. In under 1 month, the Polish nation had been erased entirely from the globe. Global observers looked on with shock as a conflict unlike any prior event materialized. Rather than static trenches, this fresh assault traveled with ruinous pace. Above, the Luftwaffe obliterated runways before hostile jets could even lift off. Below, armour shattered gaps which mobile infantry secured with extreme exactness. Trucked columns never paused. They bypassed pockets of defiance, trapped them, and pushed forward. Every day of progress signalled the breakdown of another hostile sector. In 3 weeks, the Polish forces had surrendered half of their combat power. To foreign experts, the term Blitzkrieg, lightning war, turned into a label for total invincibility. Underneath the display of speed rested an often misunderstood leadership layout. The Wehrmacht did not utilize a stiff strategy, but a pliable philosophy rooted in regional freedom. Every commander possessed the right to strike immediately if the environment required it. This decentralization, coming from the Prussian heritage, permitted rapid tactical choices across a front spanning thousands of kilometers. Armour talked via wireless, a tool the coalition had not yet fully utilized. The merger of movement, signaling, and discipline produced a numbing impact on the rivals. The strike on France during May 1940 validated the legend. While the coalition leadership anticipated a frontal push through Belgium, the mass of the German force gathered in the Ardennes woods, deemed impassable for heavy machinery. In merely 3 days, over 40 divisions traversed this land, aided by technicians who paved routes through bends and hills. On the 13th of May, the armoured units reached the Meuse stream. Stuka aircraft disabled the French spots at Sedan, and the battalions crossed behind a vapour screen. The coalition line was split in two. In under 1 week, the Nazi drive had reached the English rear. Paris lay at their mercy. The coalition units, better in totals and armour, were split and messy. Their philosophy of flat defence was unable to react to a rival that travelled like a live wire. Reports were stalled, commands arrived late, and strikes were aimed at vacant spots. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe ruled the heavens with repeated raids on retreating lines. At Dunkirk, hundreds of thousands of English and French troops were trapped against the waves. Only a frantic sea rescue stopped complete destruction. On the 14th of June, Paris collapsed without a final conflict. In 6 weeks, the most famous military in Europe was beaten. The Lightning War was not merely about pace. It concerned exactness. Mechanized columns led the way, followed by foot units holding the territory. Wireless kept steady links with Stuka planes, which hit spots chosen by scouts on the ground. Leaders had maps refreshed nearly instantly thanks to riders and couriers. The rival, caught in clashing commands and signal stalls, appeared to travel in slow motion. Full harmony between the distinct wings of the military turned every strike into a clinical hit that broke defences in a few hours. In the spring of 1940, the Wehrmacht used over 130 divisions on the Western Line, though just a third were truly motorized. However, the mental shock of these units was far higher. The Panzers made the scene heart of a system that actually still used horses and stolen civilian rigs. But this structural flaw was not visible from the outside. What the world witnessed was a string of rapid triumphs. Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Holland and France had collapsed in under 1 year. The map of Europe looked to be turning grey. Coalition leaders were slow to grasp that blitzkrieg was no fresh category of gear, but a fresh method of thinking about combat. The secret rested in the gathering of power and the use of minutes as a tool. Every hour saved turned into a supply and spirit perk. German leaders, schooled in the heritage of maneuvering, used pace to breed chaos. The philosophy of circling motion took the place of the head-on charge. Instead of breaking the rival on their main row, they boxed them in, severed their food, and stayed for their surrender. Thousands of captives were taken without long combat. In London, the collapse of France created a sense of total loneliness. Hitler had done what the German Reich had missed in 1914, crushing France in a few weeks. Western Europe sat under his thumb. In the east, the Kremlin watched with worry. To the south, Italy joined the pact. In the Balkan lands, German political weight was taking the place of raids. It looked as though the whole region was yielding to a relentless engine. The Lightning War turned into a fable, not just for its success, but for its mental weight. Pictures of tank lines moving past flaming towns, Stuka planes screaming down with sirens like human whales, and long rows of coalition captives built a feeling of ruin. Conflict had turned into a dance of precision and dread. To foreign viewers, Germany looked to have found a final recipe for success. Actually, that scene beauty masked a deep fragility. The rapid triumphs relied on a supply chain pulled to its ends, with gear needing to move via crowded paths. Hot blocks, gear wear, and a lack of parts grew with every mile. German works were not yet fully geared for war, and oil stocks were low. But these walls were not seen on the maps. What the people saw was a force that, in under 1 year, had brought half of Europe to its knees. The Nazi brass grew their fame. The leaders who had feared the Ardennes Plan turned into idols. Guderian, Kleist, and Rommel became signs of the fresh style of war. Military schools globally watched their moves with shock. In coalition rooms, they tried to learn how a force with fewer tools had beaten better armies. The truth arrived late. The war had changed for good. While Hitler toasted in Paris, the German engine was getting ready for the next step. Velocity had been its best tool, but also its coming ruin. At that point, though, nobody knew it. From Oslo to Bordeaux, Nazi flags waved over halls. The land was tamed, the rivals scattered. The coalition forces fled. Europe in 1940 looked on the verge of a forced union under German law. The Lightning War had kept its vow, a flash that in a few months lit and burned all it met: the French ruin and the Seine mainland rule. On the 14th of June, 1940, Paris fell quietly. There were no street fights, no planned defiance. Nazi units walked down the Champs-Élysées as the folks watched from windows. In 46 days, the French force, seen as a top power in Europe, had been broken. The Wehrmacht moved 650 kilometers in just 6 weeks. What started as a push through the Ardennes turned into the fall of the whole Western safety net. The French brass had put their trust in the Maginot Line, a wall of stone reaching from Luxembourg to Switzerland. They thought no armour could pass the Ardennes woods, but on the 10th of May, the Panzers did. Within 3 days, Nazi units crossed the Meuse stream and cut a 100-kilometre hole in the line. The confused French leaders gave clashing orders. The coalition armour, spread in tiny bands, was wrecked one by grouped German units. In under a week, the North Front had broken. The German lines moved hard while Belgian and British units tried to fix themselves. The panzers moved to the ocean, cutting the retreat line. By the 20th of May, the coast was in Nazi hands. 40 coalition divisions were boxed in at Dunkirk. For 9 days, the Luftwaffe hit the sands while the fleet ran a wild rescue. Over 330,000 men got away, but they left 60,000 captives and nearly all heavy gear. The exit saved the lives, but it lost the fight. The French military tried to build a fresh line on the Somme. They lacked time. On the 5th of June, the next German strike began. Tank units crossed streams under steady air help. Tired French groups lacked men and fuel. Links between foot soldiers and planes were dead. Within 10 days, the walls fell. On the 14th of June, Nazi troops entered Paris freely. The regime fled to Bordeaux. 8 days later, Marshal Pétain asked for a truce. France had been beaten in half the time it took Germany in 1870. The deal signed in Compiègne on the 22nd of June mirrored the events of 1918, but backwards. Hitler told the group to meet in the same train car where Germany had yielded at the end of the Great War. This time, the parts were flipped. France was split into 2 parts, the held zone run by Germans and the so-called free zone run from Vichy under Nazi eyes. The north, the coast and Paris were put under German army rule. The French system was put to work for the Reich. With France gone, Germany ruled the heart of Europe. Norway, Denmark, Belgium and the Netherlands were already occupied. Italy had officially joined the Axis. In the east, the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact. In the south, Spain remained neutral but sympathetic. Only Great Britain resisted. In less than a year, Hitler had reversed the continental balance of power. The Reich's borders stretched from the Atlantic to the Baltic. The conquered industries began producing for Germany. French automobile, aircraft, and armament factories were placed under military control. Thousands of workers were forced to manufacture parts for the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht. German trains carried machinery, coal, and food eastward. In a short time, the economy of occupied Europe was integrated into the German system. Paris, Brussels, and Amsterdam became the administrative centers of the new order. The German administration functioned with bureaucratic precision. In France, the Vichy regime implemented anti-Semitic laws, censorship, and police cooperation. In Belgium and the Netherlands, civilian governments were established under military supervision. In Norway, the collaborationist Vidkun Quisling assumed power. In every occupied country, the Gestapo established political control offices. Prisoner of war camps were filled with captured soldiers, dissidents, and Jews. The domination was not limited to the military. Culture, the press, and education were subjected to systematic propaganda. Meanwhile, the Wehrmacht was reorganizing its forces. More than half the army was reassigned for future operations. Bases for submarines and long-range aircraft were established in French ports. Brest, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire were transformed into coastal fortresses. The British fleet, which had dominated the seas, now had to contend with a hostile coastline stretching for thousands of kilometers. German submarines departed from the Atlantic, shortening the distance to enemy convoys. In Berlin, the victory reinforced the idea that domination of Europe was only a matter of time. The German army had demonstrated unquestionable tactical and moral superiority. No continental nation could challenge it. In the capital's parades, the banners of the victorious divisions were presented to the Führer. The names of Sedan, Arras, and Dunkirk became symbols of glory. Propaganda celebrated Hitler as the architect of a new unified Europe. But the French victory also generated a dangerous illusion. The speed of the triumph led to the conviction that the war could be repeated using the same methods in any theatre. Commanders believed that the combination of tanks, aircraft, and surprise would be enough to defeat any enemy. At that time, however, the Reich seemed unstoppable. Maps displayed in military headquarters showed a continent under German control, with borders stretching from the North Sea to the Alps, from the English Channel to the Baltic. More than 300 million people lived under its direct or indirect rule. Railway lines were reorganized to supply the army and transport raw materials. French power lines were connected to the German grid. Atlantic ports began receiving supplies from Scandinavia and the Balkans. Roads were filled with military convoys. In less than a year, Europe had been transformed into a logistical infrastructure at Berlin's service. German ministries planned the systematic exploitation of every territory. From Vienna to Lille, occupation became routine. Isolated Britain faced the prospect of invasion. Operation Sea Lion, planned for the summer, depended on air control over the English Channel. The Luftwaffe prepared for the final assault. On the 10th of July, 1940, the Battle of Britain began. Thousands of aircraft took off from French airfields to attack British targets. It was the first time the Reich had extended its power beyond the continent. The war seemed to be decided in the skies. As the bombers crossed the Channel, Hitler was confident that the United Kingdom would sue for peace. He considered the British people a sister nation and hoped for a favourable negotiation. He sent indirect messages through Swedish and Swiss intermediaries. London did not respond. Churchill, the newly appointed Prime Minister, vowed to resist at any cost. The blitzkrieg that had devastated Poland and France was crashing against an island that refused to yield. In the summer of 1940, the Third Reich reached its greatest extent to date. It controlled directly or indirectly more than 60% of European industrial production. It held the defeated armies of 8 countries under its control. It possessed access to agricultural resources, coal, iron, and abundant labour. On the surface, nothing could stop it. In practice, however, this expansion had its own limits. Its success had been so rapid that the logistical apparatus could not sustain it indefinitely. In July of that year, the map of the continent showed a unified central bloc under German authority. The roads were patrolled by Wehrmacht forces. Trains ran on strict schedules dictated by the military administration. At stations, bilingual signs in German replaced local names. Radio stations broadcast speeches and military marches. The new Europe was being born under the sign of imposed order. The domination was total. The continent had been conquered not only by force of arms, but by the idea of a superiority that seemed unquestionable. For the first time since Napoleon, a single power controlled the heart of Europe. On the maps in Berlin, the red arrows pointed west, north, and south. The next one inevitably would point east. The Battle of England, the limit of air power. On the 10th of July, 1940, the first decisive air battle in modern history began, which put the first brake on Hitler. The Battle of Britain transformed the European balance of power. For the first time since 1939, the Reich was not advancing. The air supremacy that had enabled victories over Poland and France had met its match. The Luftwaffe, designed for ground tactical support, had been forced into a strategic war for which it was ill-prepared. Its bombers lacked the range and destructive power necessary to completely destroy British infrastructure. Every flight over the Channel was a gamble of life and death. For 70 consecutive days, the Luftwaffe crossed the English Channel in waves from French, Belgian, and Dutch bases. Squadrons of fighters and bombers took off with a single objective: to destroy the Royal Air Force. The invasion of England, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, depended on it. Without air superiority, no landing was possible. The order was clear: eliminate British resistance in 4 weeks. The initial attacks focused on the convoys supplying the island. Stuka dive bombers attacked merchant ships and ports, sinking tons of supplies. The British fleet responded with anti-aircraft fire, but the sea became a battleground every day. Dozens of German aircraft crashed into the Channel, while others managed to destroy shipyards and docks. Losses were heavy, but the Germans were confident in their numerical superiority. More than 2,500 aircraft were assigned to the campaign compared to only 600 operational British fighters. The advantage seemed overwhelming. In mid-July, the Luftwaffe changed tactics. The convoys had held up better than expected. Now the targets would be the airfields and radar stations of southern England. Heinkel, Dornier and Junkers bombers flew in tight formations escorted by Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters. Their objective was to neutralize the ground-air defences. British fighter command pilots took off up to 5 times a day. The radar system detected enemy formations as they crossed the channel, allowing the fighters to scramble just in time to intercept them. This early detection network, invisible to the Germans, changed the course of the battle. The skies over southern England became a permanent battleground. Fighters clashed at altitudes of 5,000 metres, reaching speeds in excess of 500 kilometres per hour. Spitfires and Hurricanes took turns in coordinated attacks. The lighter and more manoeuvrable British fighters descended from the sun to surprise the enemy. In the air, the duels were brief and brutal. A single hit was enough to set the fuselage ablaze. Downed aircraft crashed onto fields, roads and villages. The sound of air raid sirens became a part of everyday life. Between the 8th and 18th of August, the Luftwaffe launched its most intense offensive. More than 1,700 missions were flown in 10 days. On the 13th of August, known as Eagle Day, 1,500 aircraft crossed the Channel. Bombers attacked the airfields at Biggin Hill, Hornchurch and Tangmere. Runways were cratered, hangars ruined, but the British repaired the damage within hours. Fighters took off from secondary airstrips and continued fighting. In a single day, the Germans lost 75 aircraft. Hitler expected the Air Force to collapse within days. It did not happen. Upon the 24th of August, a group of Nazi aircraft went off course and released their payload upon London. It was an orientation blunder, yet it altered the character of the conflict. In vengeance, the Air Force struck Berlin. For the initial instance, the Reich's hub faced assault. Enraged, Hitler mandated a shift in approach. Desert the runways and focus upon the wholesale strike of municipalities. The Blitz commenced. Nightly, hundreds of Nazi aircraft travelled over London, Liverpool, Coventry and Birmingham. The goal was to shatter civilian grit and compel yield. For 57 straight nights, London blazed. Fire brightened the heavens and vapour masked the sunrise. Thousands of structures were wrecked and tens of thousands of civilians perished. Tube tunnels were packed until daybreak. Still, the Air Force stayed active. British pilots, although weary, held daylight rule. Aviators rested few hours, dined in their seats and ascended once more in September. The Luftwaffe scaled up its raids. Over 1,000 jets traversed the water on the 15th of September in what was meant as the concluding strike. It was the day the momentum of the push flipped. Radar spotted the Nazi waves of raids in time. Over 600 British pilots rose to block them. The combat flared from the Thames to the southern edge in one day. The British downed 56 hostile jets. Their own casualties were 26. Churchill tracked the fight from the war hub and spoke a line that would turn iconic. Never was so much owed to so many by so few. For Germany, it was the start of lasting erosion. The Luftwaffe lost its most skilled pilots. Their heirs lacked enough schooling. By the close of September, the result was plain. The Royal Air Force was yet standing, bases were active, sensors were working, and shops were making more fighters than ever. The Luftwaffe, conversely, was battling a lack of hands, oil and gear. The Messerschmitt fighters had short range and could hardly guard jets over London. The Heinkel and Dornier bombers, without proper shield, turned into easy kills. Every task led to rising losses. In October, the Nazi leaders halted Operation Sea Lion. The raid was shelved for good. The air loss had swift results. For the first instance, the Reich had met a standing foe. Until then, every drive had ended in surrender or truce. In England, there was no talk nor political break. The land stood firm, held by a geared people and a rising shop. The sum of British fighters built in September beat the losses of the month. Factory power started to tip the scales. The Luftwaffe moved its focus again during the winter of 1940 to 41. Strikes hit ports and factory hubs. Coventry was nearly totally wrecked. In November, Liverpool and Hull were struck often. The gear loss was huge, but work never stopped. The rail lines stayed active and shops moved their gear underground. Meanwhile, radar grew its scope and truth. Every night, beams lit the sky with crossing paths, showing the route of hostile jets for the guns. The Nazis tried fresh moves like spread night strikes and the use of fire to show spots. The Air Force replied with night jets, having basic radar. Fights in the dark turned normal. Despite the work, Nazi losses grew. The Luftwaffe had lost over 1,700 jets since July. The British just over 900. The scales were no longer good. Hitler saw that a win in the sky was not coming. In January 1941, the Nazi heads moved some of their power to the south and the Balkans. The Reich's gaze was moving from the water. The Lightning War had failed once. The Nazi army stayed top on land, but it could not cross the sea. British tech and layout held by radar and the Central Signal Hub had stopped the Nazi drive. England stayed the coalition hub of work, whole and loud. During the following months, the British skies remained the scene of isolated skirmishes. The Luftwaffe carried out sporadic attacks to distract the air defences, but without any clear strategic objectives, the hardened population grew accustomed to the sound of the air raid sirens. Cities were rebuilt while bombs still fell. Factories operated around the clock. New fighter planes rolled off the assembly line every week. What had begun as a decisive offensive ended in a war of attrition. The British learned to live under constant threat. In London, underground shelters, thousands slept amidst the noise of explosions and the smell of dust. Children were evacuated to the countryside while firefighters and volunteers battled the flames night after night. Propaganda insisted that individual sacrifice sustained collective freedom, and this conviction became a form of defense. The Luftwaffe, unable to break civilian morale, gradually wore itself out in a campaign with no concrete results. By the end of 1941, air superiority remained in British hands and the Reich's aerial defeat had become a symbol of national resistance. When winter ended, the Western Front stabilized. Germany controlled continental Europe, but not the airspace over the Channel. Great Britain remained an unsinkable aircraft carrier off the German coast. In the spring of 1941, while the air raid sirens still wailed in London, maps in German headquarters began to show a new direction of attack. The arrows for the first time pointed east. Barbarossa, the dream of annihilation. On the 22nd of June, 1941, at 3:15 in the morning, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border. Within hours, 150 Wehrmacht divisions stretched across a front of nearly 3,000 kilometers from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Operation Barbarossa began with a simultaneous barrage of artillery, tanks, and aerial bombardment. It was the largest land invasion in history. In the first few minutes, the Luftwaffe attacked 66 Soviet airfields and destroyed more than 1,800 aircraft on the ground. The surprise was complete. The attack was divided into 3 army groups. The northern group advanced toward Leningrad, the central group toward Moscow, and the southern group toward Ukraine and the Caucasus. The coordination was precise. Panzer divisions led the columns, followed by motorized infantry and support troops. Each unit had orders to advance without halt, encircle, and destroy. The first few days were a parade of victories. Minsk fell on the 28th of June. 300,000 Soviet prisoners were captured. By the 10th of July, Smolensk was surrounded. In the pockets around Kiev and Uman, hundreds of thousands more were taken prisoner. Soviet losses in the first 2 months exceeded 2 million men. The Germans advanced at a rate of 30 kilometers per day. The dirt roads were covered in dust and debris. Resistance was fragmented. The Soviet divisions, surprised and poorly coordinated, dissolved under the combined attacks. Panzers crossed rivers on makeshift bridges, while Stukas destroyed entire retreating columns. Reports from the front described a disorganized enemy lacking communication and morale. In Berlin, High Command spoke of certain victory before winter. In reality, the campaign had begun with a fatal delay. The invasion was supposed to start in May, but operations in the Balkans postponed it by 6 weeks. That margin disrupted the logistical schedule. The German army was unprepared for a winter in the east, but by June that seemed irrelevant. Optimism was absolute. Trains carried supplies to Poland, where thousands of trucks distributed them to the front. Fuel, however, was beginning to run low. Supply lines were stretched with each advance. At the end of July, Army Group Center reached the outskirts of Smolensk, 400 kilometers from Moscow. There, Soviet resistance intensified for the first time. The Germans faced coordinated counterattacks. The T-34 tanks with their sloped armor and 76mm guns withstood hits that would destroy Panzer III and IV tanks. Soviet engines continued to operate under impossible conditions: mud, dust, and extreme temperatures. The Luftwaffe, although superior, was beginning to lose its advantage due to distance. The forward airfields were rapidly becoming obsolete. The front was too wide, the space too vast. Despite the difficulties, the victories continued. On the 19th of September, Kiev fell. More than 600,000 prisoners were captured in the largest encirclement in military history. Columns of captives stretched for miles. Reports spoke of 50,000 dead in the first few days of the march. German commanders celebrated the success as proof that the Red Army was finished. But each new victory meant more territory to occupy, more distance to cover, more fuel to transport. Already strained oil reserves were dwindling dangerously. Army Group North advanced toward Leningrad. On the 8th of September, the city was cut off. 2.5 million inhabitants were trapped. The Germans surrounded the city by land, while the Navy blocked access via Lake Ladoga. The bombardment began immediately. Food supplies were depleted within weeks. During the winter, hundreds of thousands of civilians died of starvation. Leningrad resisted, but at an unimaginable cost. The German order was clear: do not accept surrender. Let the city die. In the center, the offensive toward Moscow resumed in October under the name Operation Typhoon. Panzer groups converged on the Soviet capital. On the 7th of October, the weather changed abruptly. Torrential rains turned the roads into a sea of mud. Trucks sank up to their axles. Tanks advanced at a snail's pace. Units became separated. Communications failed. The Luftwaffe could not take off from the muddy airfields. The advance, which had been dizzying in the summer, came to a halt. Soldiers without proper clothing slept in flooded trenches. When the cold weather arrived, the German front was less than 30 kilometers from Moscow. Patrols spotted the city's domes through binoculars, but the temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. Lubricants froze. Guns wouldn't fire. Engines wouldn't start. Horses died by the thousands. Soldiers wrapped rags around their boots. Fuel and ammunition supplies were cut off. The offensive literally froze. On the 5th of December, the Soviets launched a general counteroffensive with 100 fresh divisions. It was the first time since the start of the war that the Wehrmacht had retreated. The Red Army, reorganized and reinforced with troops from Siberia, pushed the Germans back more than 200 kilometers. Snow covered the corpses and abandoned tanks. The German lines, stretched to their limits, were crumbling. Local commanders requested permission to withdraw, but Hitler's order was inflexible: hold your ground. The retreat became a chain of disasters. Losses between December and January exceeded 250,000. The exhausted Luftwaffe could barely supply the isolated troops. The myth of German invincibility was shattered for the first time in the East. In the south, Army Group South had captured much of Ukraine. Wheat fields burned in the wake of the Soviet withdrawal. Agricultural production was rendered useless. Occupied cities were systematically looted. The SS and the Reich police began mass executions of civilians, Jews, and political commissars. At Babi Yar outside Kiev, more than 33,000 people were murdered in 2 days. The orders were to eliminate any resistance through terror. The war in the East was not conventional. It was ideological and racial. German losses, though high, seemed manageable at first. But the real figures grew every week. In the first 6 months, the Wehrmacht had lost more than 700,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. Half of its initial force was out of action. Replacement was slow. Factories couldn't produce enough tanks and trucks to compensate for the losses. Soviet production, on the other hand, was increasing. Armaments plants had been dismantled and moved beyond the Urals. By autumn, they were once again producing thousands of T-34s and cannons every month. Germany hadn't destroyed the enemy's industrial heartland. It had only displaced it. By the end of 1941, the Eastern Front had stabilized into an irregular line stretching from Leningrad to the Black Sea. The distances were immense. Over 2,000 kilometers of trenches, barbed wire, and frozen positions. Field hospitals were overflowing. Soldiers suffered from frostbite, dysentery, and exhaustion. Winter had halted the blitzkrieg. Supplies arrived late, and horses died along the way. The war of movement was over. What remained was a war of endurance. In Berlin, propaganda continued to proclaim imminent victory. Maps showed the front line at the gates of Moscow. In reality, the German army had failed in its primary objective: to destroy the Red Army in a single campaign. Human and material losses exceeded all expectations. What was meant to be a 6-month operation had become an endless conflict. The dream of a swift conquest faded amidst the snow of the Russian winter. By the spring of 1942, the Eastern Front had claimed 500,000 lives. German divisions were slowly reorganizing, reinforced with newly formed units. Armored vehicles were being repaired with improvised parts, and soldiers were receiving winter uniforms for the first time. The Blitzkrieg had reached its physical and logistical limits. The German army had advanced further than ever before in modern history, but its machinery had crashed against the vastness of the territory and the resilience of an enemy that had not been destroyed. The dream of total annihilation had ended beneath the snow. War economy, the impossibility of sustaining the empire. When the Reich launched its invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, its economic structure was already stretched to its limits. The German production system had never been designed for protracted warfare, but rather for rapid campaigns. Blitzkrieg was not just a military tactic, it was an economic necessity. Each offensive had to be self-financed through the conquest of resources. The initial success masked a profound problem. The Reich could not simultaneously sustain the occupation of Western Europe, the war in the Atlantic, and a full-scale campaign in the East. The German model of warfare depended on the exploitation of occupied territories. France provided food, coal, and steel. Norway, strategic minerals. The Balkans, limited oil and aluminum. But military consumption quickly outpaced any capacity for replenishment. German production of synthetic fuel derived from coal covered only half of the Wehrmacht's needs. Each offensive consumed reserves that could not be regenerated. The planners hoped that the conquest of Ukraine and the Caucasus would solve the energy problem. It did not. Soviet oil fields were out of reach, and those that were captured were destroyed by the Soviets themselves during their retreat. The logistical system was inadequate to support the scale of Operation Barbarossa. Of the 3,300 locomotives sent to the Eastern Front, more than half were out of service before winter. Soviet railway lines used a different gauge, forcing the reconstruction of thousands of kilometers. Transportation relied on horses and confiscated civilian trucks. Automobile production, limited by shortages of rubber and steel, could not replace the losses. The Wehrmacht advanced faster than it could be supplied. Every extra kilometre meant more fuel consumed to carry fewer supplies. The imbalance was also demographic. Germany had mobilised more than half of its male population. Between the ages of 18 and 40, industry survived thanks to the incorporation of women, prisoners and foreign workers. In 1942, more than 7 million forced labourers worked in German factories. They were captured Poles, Ukrainians, French and Soviets. Productivity was low and sabotage was frequent. Territorial expansion multiplied the need for military occupation, draining human resources that could not be replaced. In the early years of the war, the regime avoided adopting a fully militarized economy. Hitler feared that total mobilization like the British or Soviet models would damage civilian morale until 1942. Ministries competed with one another. The Armaments Ministry, the Economy Ministry, the SS, and the Luftwaffe each managed their own industries and budgets. This fragmentation prevented rational planning. The Nazi bureaucracy rewarded rivalry, not efficiency. Resources were allocated according to political power, not strategic necessity. Hermann Göring, at the head of the 4-year plan, concentrated authority without achieving concrete results. His priority was maintaining privileges rather than resolving shortages. The collapse of the winter campaign in Russia forced a complete overhaul of the economic structure. In February 1942, Fritz Todt, the Minister of Armaments, died in a plane crash and was replaced by Albert Speer. His appointment signalled an attempt to streamline production. Speer centralised factory management, standardised production methods and expanded the use of slave labour. He managed to increase armament production despite Allied bombing raids. But this increase was more apparent than real. Most of it stemmed from simplified designs and a focus on fewer types of weapons. It was not a matter of material growth, but rather a reorganisation on an exhausted foundation. The German economy had no strategic reserves. Coal came from the Ruhr region, iron from Lorraine and Norway, and oil from Romania. Any disruption jeopardised the entire system. As the war progressed, transportation became the critical bottleneck. Allied bombing raids destroyed bridges, factories, and railway hubs. Trucks were diverted to the Eastern Front, where they were lost at a rate of thousands per month. The Air Force consumed most of the available fuel. By 1943, the Luftwaffe was using 50% of the Reich's gasoline, leaving the Army and Navy with just enough for limited operations. The agricultural system suffered a parallel decline. Millions of rural workers were sent to the front or transferred to factories. Harvests relied on prisoners of war and women. Food production fell drastically between 1941 and 1943. The occupied territories were plundered to compensate for shortages, especially Ukraine, considered the breadbasket of the Reich. Shipments of grain and livestock were made at the cost of local famines. In the occupied eastern region, starvation was a deliberate tool of control, but this strategy undermined long-term production capacity. The fields were left without labour or infrastructure. At a structural level, the Reich never managed to economically integrate the conquered territories. The administration was chaotic and contradictory. Each region was under military, civilian, or SS control with overlapping jurisdictions. This lack of coordination prevented efficient exploitation. Initial plans, such as General Plan Ost, envisioned colonizing and Germanizing the East through mass deportations and slavery. In practice, the system became unproductive. Executions and deportations reduced the available workforce, and the transport of millions of prisoners overwhelmed the railway lines. The racial utopia was destroying the very material base that was meant to sustain it. In 1942, the Reich reached its greatest territorial extent, but also its economic turning point. The campaign in the East consumed 80% of the military budget. The production of tanks, aircraft, and ammunition barely covered losses. Oil supplies plummeted to critical levels. The advance into the Caucasus was aimed precisely at reaching the oil fields of Maikop and Grozny. When they were captured, they were ablaze. Neither ever produced again. The offensive became a logistical trap. Mechanized columns advanced into roadless regions, consuming more fuel than they could transport. By the time the Sixth Army was encircled at Stalingrad, the entire system was already showing irreversible cracks. The effort to maintain the pace of the war led to the full exploitation of slave labor. By 1943, over 25% of industrial workers in Germany were foreigners. The regime deported millions of civilians from occupied countries. Conditions were brutal: 16-hour workdays, minimal food, and constant punishment. Factories operated under military supervision. Productivity temporarily increased, but sabotage and disease proliferated. Violence became the substitute for efficiency. The financial system also succumbed. Budgets were covered by domestic debt and unbacked currency issuance. Occupation costs were passed on to the subjugated countries through taxes and confiscations. France alone had to pay 400 million francs daily in occupation expenses. German banks drained the gold and foreign currency reserves of all of Europe. But this wealth was not transformed into production. It was consumed by military and bureaucratic maintenance. The empire was inherently deficit-ridden. The contrast with the Soviet Union became stark in 1943. While Germany was depleting its reserves, the Soviets were multiplying their production capacity. Factories relocated to the Urals, the Volga, and Siberia operated around the clock. Central planning eliminated the dispersion of efforts. The Soviet economy became an exclusively military system. The result was armament production that by the end of 1943 surpassed Germany's in every category: tanks, artillery, aircraft, and ammunition. Germany had lost the war of resources before losing it on the battlefield. Within the Reich, Allied strategic bombing intensified the collapse. Synthetic oil production plummeted by 90% after the 1944 attacks. The Leuna and Pohlitz refineries were rendered unusable. Without fuel, tanks sat idle and aircraft were grounded. Rail transport ground to a halt. Industrial cities, Essen, Hamburg, Dresden, burned in firestorms. The productive apparatus was reduced to ruins. The empire that had conquered Europe depended on factories that no longer existed. Speer's attempt to maintain production through decentralization and the use of underground tunnels prolonged the collapse, but did not stop it. In the final months of 1944, the assembly lines operated without a reliable electricity supply, with malnourished workers and substandard materials. Official statistics continued to show inflated figures, but the front lines were no longer receiving supplies. The Wehrmacht fought with vehicles lacking spare parts, limited ammunition, and poorly equipped soldiers. The empire, born of speed, was trapped in paralysis. The inability to sustain the war effort was more than a military outcome. It was the consequence of an unsustainable economic model. The Reich had based its expansion on plunder, not production. Each conquest temporarily fueled the next until the cycle broke down. Ideology, lack of coordination, and poor planning destroyed the efficiency that had made the Blitzkrieg possible. By 1944, Germany was producing more advanced weapons than ever before, but it no longer had the means to supply, transport, or defend them. Traitors and the erosion of Nazi power. From 1943 onward, the Reich began to fracture from within. What had been a machine of obedience and control began to show cracks. Allied bombing raids destroyed more than 45 cities, paralyzing the industrial network and creating millions of displaced people. Train stations were overflowing with refugees, and trains destined for the front no longer carried civilians. Hamburg, Cologne, and Essen became burning ruins. The promise of absolute security that the regime had made since 1933 evaporated amidst the rubble. The administrative apparatus responded to the collapse with improvisation. Overlapping ministries competed with one another. Göring, Speer, Himmler, and Goebbels each ruled their own spheres. The provinces functioned as local fiefs where the Gauleiters acted with complete autonomy. Without a coherent command structure, orders from Berlin were lost amidst the rubble. Each authority proclaimed its own plan of total resistance, and each demanded more men, more production, more sacrifice. Factories operated under sirens and power outages. Workers slept in shelters, and the state continued to demand impossible quotas. As the war drew closer to the Reich's borders, police control intensified. The Gestapo operated in a climate of total paranoia. Denunciations multiplied. In 1944, 1 in 10 arrests stemmed from a neighbour's report. Summary executions for defeatism or unpatriotic remarks became routine. However, fear was no longer enough. Prisons were overflowing and concentration camps were bursting at the seams. The execution of deserters increased exponentially. More than 20,000 soldiers were executed between 1944 and 1945 for refusing to fight. The material collapse of the cities was accompanied by a moral collapse. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion made it impossible to maintain the rhetoric of victory. Ration books were reduced every 3 months. Women spent hours in lines for bread and coal. In winter, families dismantled furniture to feed themselves or heat their shelters. Hospitals, overflowing with the wounded and burned, operated without anesthesia or electricity. In working-class neighbourhoods, bodies lay in the streets for days. Propaganda continued to speak of heroic resistance, but the reality was disintegration. The total mobilization decreed by Goebbels in February 1943 transformed civilian life into an extension of the front lines. Women between the ages of 17 and 45 were forced to work in factories, offices, or air defense. Teenagers were drafted into the Hitler Youth to replace adults who had died or been taken prisoner. The elderly were integrated into the Volkssturm, an improvised militia with no training or proper weaponry. The state no longer recruited, it exploited. By the autumn of 1944, more than 2 million children and elderly men had been sent to dig trenches or wield rifles without ammunition. The last defences of the Reich were school children in patched-up uniforms. The judicial system mirrored the radicalisation. Special courts handed down sentences in minutes. Martial law was extended throughout the country. Mayors could order executions without trial. Hitler's orders were broadcast by radio and carried out to the letter. The Führer had supplanted the state. His word carried the weight of a sentence. Nazi legality disintegrated under its own weight. In the final months, public executions were used as a warning. In Berlin, prisoners hanging from lampposts with signs reading "Traitor to the Fatherland" were displayed. It was a spectacle of fear. Propaganda, now the regime's last lifeline, turned desperate. Goebbels spoke of total war, while broadcasts were interrupted by air raid sirens. Radio stations aired false reports and repetitive slogans. The Führer remains in control. Censorship concealed the loss of Paris, Warsaw, and Budapest. But people secretly listened to foreign stations, and the truth circulated in whispers. Patriotic songs were replaced by silence. The jubilation of 1939 had given way to resignation. In the streets, Hitler's portrait still hung, but covered in dust and soot. The industrial collapse exacerbated the demoralization. Bombed-out factories moved underground, but actual production fell by 60% between 1944 and 1945. Power outages were constant. Rail transport was destroyed. A third of the locomotives were out of service. The trains that still ran carried wounded soldiers or corpses. Inland cities filled with refugees from the east. By January 1945, more than 12 million civilians were fleeing East Prussia and Silesia as the Soviet advance approached. The roads were covered with endless columns of carts and frozen bodies. The rearguard had become another front. In the midst of the chaos, the Reich's political structure crumbled. The Gauleiters became local warlords. Some attempted to negotiate surrenders. Others ordered resistance to the bitter end. In Hamburg, Karl Kaufmann allowed British troops to enter without a fight. In Berlin, Goebbels and Bormann transformed the city into a fortress. Civil disobedience appeared for the first time at the heart of the regime. Officials destroyed archives, hid documents, or deserted. Loyalty to the Führer, sustained by 12 years of discipline, quietly dissolved. The police system, which had maintained absolute control, fragmented. Communications between the Gestapo, the SS, and the army broke down. By April 1945, many cities lacked any recognized authority. Soldiers deserted en masse, dressed in civilian clothes. Volkssturm patrols shot anyone they found fleeing. In the chaos, thousands of executions went unrecorded. In Berlin, orders to shoot traitors included doctors, firefighters, and railway workers. The regime was dying while killing. The psychological impact was devastating. From 1944 onward, medical reports spoke of epidemics of fatigue, hysteria, and nervous breakdowns. The population lived under extreme deprivation. Schools served as shelters, hospitals as morgues. The education system disintegrated. Children learned to identify the sound of a Lancaster bomber or a B-17 before they learned to read. The generation born in the 1930s grew up in darkness amidst ruins and fear. For them, the Reich was nothing but the noise of sirens, bombing raids, and smoke. In the final months, propaganda attempted to transform the catastrophe into an epic. Films glorified the idea of ultimate sacrifice. Newsreels showed soldiers swearing allegiance to the Führer as Berlin burned. Goebbels promised that the German people would rise from the ashes, but no one believed in redemption anymore. In the shelters, people listened to the explosions in silence. The external terror had become an internal state. When the Soviet army entered Germany in January 1945, the home front no longer existed. The state had dissolved into fragments, its institutions functioning on autopilot. The people, indoctrinated for a decade, still obeyed even the most absurd orders, not out of faith, but out of habit. Fear was the only thing that remained intact. The Nazi power structure, built on discipline, control, and propaganda, collapsed without organized resistance. The Reich that had promised to last 1,000 years was extinguished in 2 months of chaos and silence. The military collapse and the crisis of the German command. The summer of 1943 marked the definitive military turning point for the Third Reich. The defeat at Stalingrad had shattered the myth of invincibility, but the Battle of Kursk completely destroyed it. Between July 5th and 13th, more than 3,000 German tanks were launched in an offensive intended to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. The result was a disaster. The Wehrmacht lost nearly 1,500 armoured vehicles and 200,000 men in just 10 days. For the first time, the Soviets withstood a mechanized attack and counterattacked with numerical and material superiority. The strategic balance had been broken. From then on, the German command operated in a state of perpetual denial. Hitler concentrated all operational authority in his own hands. The generals no longer made decisions. The Führer's orders went directly to the front, bypassing the general staff. Instead of tactical retreats, orders were given to resist at all costs. On the map at Rastenburg headquarters, Hitler moved divisions that no longer existed. His distrust of professional commanders grew with each defeat. Generals who proposed withdrawals were dismissed or sent to the front as punishment. Strategy was reduced to an ideological mandate. Do not give ground. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht lost all autonomy. Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl became mere transmitters of orders, not planners. Daily briefings devolved into monologues by the Führer. Tactical decisions were made without accurate information from the ground. Reports were docked to avoid reprisals. On the Eastern Front, commanders falsified casualty reports and concealed retreats. Coordination between Army Corps collapsed. Each division fought in isolation without reinforcements, supplies, or air communication. The Wehrmacht was no longer an offensive force. From the autumn of 1943, German operations were exclusively defensive. The Soviets launched simultaneous offensives from Smolensk to the Dnieper. In the south, Ukraine was completely lost. German divisions retreated without fuel or air cover. The Luftwaffe, once master of the skies, had been reduced to a symbolic role. Losses of pilots and aircraft far exceeded replacement capacity. By 1944, Germany could produce only half the number of fighters needed to maintain even a minimal defense. The breakdown of command was exacerbated by the growing distrust within the armed forces. The SS, effectively a parallel army, answered only to Himmler. They operated with priority access to resources and fuel, which fueled resentment within the Wehrmacht. Mixed units with shared commands were paralyzed by internal rivalries. In Normandy during the Allied landings, panzer divisions remained immobile for hours due to authority disputes. The order to counterattack was withheld until it received Hitler's personal approval. He was asleep at the time. By the time he awoke, the landings were already irreversible. The Western Front collapsed in a matter of weeks. Operation Overlord and the breakthrough at Avranches opened the door to the French interior. German divisions were trapped in the Falaise encirclement. More than 40,000 men were killed. The remnants of the army retreated toward the Rhine. In Paris, the garrisons were ordered to destroy the city before surrendering. They disobeyed. For the first time since 1939, local commanders directly ignored the Führer's instructions. In the east, the situation was even more desperate. Operation Bagration, launched by the Red Army in June 1944, completely destroyed Army Group Center. In less than a month, 4 German armies vanished. Losses exceeded 400,000 men. The Reich's strategic reserves were depleted. The fronts were held only by improvised units, untrained conscripts, and the remnants of decimated formations. Retreats turned into escapes. The conspiracy of July 20th, 1944, revealed the internal fractures within the command structure. The assassination attempt against Hitler, organized by army officers, sought not only to eliminate him, but also to restore rational military leadership. It failed, and the subsequent repression dismantled what remained of the professional officer corps. More than 200 officers were executed, including Stauffenberg, Beck, and Olbricht. The purges left vacancies at every level of command. The replacements were young, fanatical officers loyal to the Führer, but inexperienced. The capacity for planning vanished. In practice, the German High Command ceased to exist. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht functioned only as a communications office. Decisions were made at the Chancellery, which was increasingly isolated from reality. Hitler refused to authorize retreats or surrenders, even when positions were indefensible. In the Baltic, Army Group North was encircled for months without permission to evacuate. In the West, the Ardennes became the site of the last German offensive. Launched in December 1944, it consumed the last fuel reserves. Tanks stalled for lack of gasoline before reaching the Meuse. The offensive collapsed within 2 weeks. Military leadership disintegrated. The field marshals were torn between obedience and pragmatism. Model, known as the Führer's fireman, attempted to contain the fronts with impossible maneuvers. Guderian, reinstated as chief of the General Staff, openly argued with Hitler, but ultimately obeyed. In the final months, operational maps were fictions. Units marked as in combat no longer existed. The chain of command was an illusion sustained by orders without recipients. Logistical breakdowns completed the disaster. The Wehrmacht lacked fuel, ammunition, and vehicles. Rail transport was destroyed. Soldiers travelled on foot or on requisitioned bicycles. Mechanized divisions existed in name only. By 1945, over 70% of the German army was fighting without motorized support. The defences of the Oder were constructed with hand tools and no engineering equipment. The Luftwaffe was barely operational. Of the 2,500 available aircraft, fewer than 800 were airworthy. Novice pilots lasted an average of 2 missions. The German command operated on fantasies. Hitler insisted on non-existent counteroffensives, on divisions that existed only on paper. The reality was total fragmentation. Communications were lost. Orders arrived days late. Radios were destroyed or captured. Field commanders made decisions on their own, often contradictory ones. In the Ruhr, some tried to surrender, others resisted to the last bullet. Discipline completely broke down. By April 1945, the situation was beyond repair. Berlin was encircled. The Führerbunker had become the last headquarters. Conferences were held under bombardment. The divisions meant to protect the capital existed only in reports. In the north, Dönitz commanded a fleet without fuel. In the south, Kesselring led remnants of armies without ammunition. German command was no longer a structure. It was a chain of orders without echo. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide in the bunker. In the following hours, Keitel, Jodl, and Dönitz vied for symbolic power. None of them had armies to command anymore. The German command had ceased to exist as an operational entity. The military collapse was not a one-off defeat. It was the downfall of a system built on blind obedience, devoid of autonomy or flexibility. When the Führer fell, the army fell with him. The collapse of the empire, the occupation and fall of the Reich. In January 1945, Germany was a wasteland. The Eastern Front was collapsing under the weight of the Soviet offensive, and in the West, the Allied armies were crossing the Rhine. The Reich, which 5 years earlier had dominated Europe, was reduced to a mass of rubble without communications or reserves. The machinery of the state barely functioned. Trains carried the wounded and refugees. Cities were smouldering ruins. On January 12th, the Soviets launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. In 3 weeks, their troops advanced more than 500 kilometers. Warsaw fell. On January 17th, Breslau was surrounded. Poznan besieged. In the north, East Prussia was cut off. The civilian population fled westward in endless columns of carts and bicycles. On the frozen roads, thousands died from the cold or under artillery fire. The Wehrmacht lacked the means to evacuate the population or halt the enemy advance. The retreat was chaotic, uncoordinated, and lacking fuel. In the west, the remnants of the German army held out against the Americans and British along the Rhine. On March 7th, American troops captured the Remagen Bridge intact. It was the final blow to the Western defences. Within days, Patton crossed the river with hundreds of tanks. The Ruhr, the industrial heart of the Reich, was encircled. Factories were destroyed, workers exhausted, and coal reserves depleted. Units trapped in the Ruhr pocket held out without ammunition until mid-April, when more than 300,000 soldiers surrendered. The German war industry had ceased to exist. The command system collapsed simultaneously. The Gauleiters acted like feudal lords in their regions, issuing orders without coordination. Some sought to negotiate with the Allies. Others executed anyone who uttered the word surrender. In Bavaria, local militias shot doctors and officials for defeatism. In Hamburg and Bremen, garrisons surrendered without firing a shot. Central control from Berlin was illusory. Orders took days to arrive, if they arrived at all. In the east, the Soviets advanced across sparsely populated burning territory. German troops destroyed bridges, railways, and depots before retreating. The Luftwaffe no longer existed as an operational force. Ground units fought without air cover or logistical support. German prisoners marched east in endless columns. Daily casualties exceeded 10,000. The army was silently disintegrating. On April 16th, Marshal Zhukov launched the final offensive on Berlin. 150 Soviet divisions, supported by 6,000 tanks and 10,000 artillery pieces, attacked the Oder defences. The Germans held out for 3 days before breaking. The capital was encircled on April 25th. Inside the city, Hitler had moved his headquarters to the Führerbunker. He directed non-existent operations, moving divisions that existed only on maps. Communications with the outside world were severed. Radio broadcasts of resistance slogans while Soviet artillery pounded the city centre. The streets of Berlin became battlefields. The combatants were Hitler youth children, Volkssturm veterans, and soldiers without ammunition. Soviet tanks advanced over piles of rubble. Underground shelters flooded. Hospitals operated without electricity or anesthesia. Goebbels toured the ruins, proclaiming the greatness of the final sacrifice. Inside the bunker, the Nazi hierarchy crumbled. Himmler attempted to negotiate a partial surrender with the Western Allies. He was discovered and dismissed. Goering claimed leadership. He was arrested on the Führer's direct orders. On April 20th, his birthday, Hitler went out into the Reich Chancellery courtyard to greet a group of young fighters. It was his last public appearance. On the 29th, he drafted his political testament and designated Karl Dönitz as his successor. The following day, he committed suicide along with Eva Braun. Their bodies were burned in the garden of the bunker. In the following hours, Goebbels poisoned his 6 children and then took his own life. Berlin was left leaderless. On May 2nd, General Weidling signed the garrison's surrender to Soviet General Chuikov. The red flag was raised over the Reichstag. In the north, Dönitz attempted to prolong the resistance to allow more civilians to escape the Soviet advance. His government in Flensburg was the last vestige of the Reich. He tried to negotiate a partial surrender with Eisenhower, but the Allied command demanded total capitulation. On May 7th in Reims, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces. It took effect at midnight on the 8th. In Moscow, it was already May 9th. The war in Europe was over. The country that had conquered the continent was reduced to ruins. The roads were filled with prisoners and refugees. More than 8 million German soldiers were captured. 30 cities had been completely destroyed. Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin were mountains of rubble. The civilian population survived among the ruins, subsisting on Allied rations. Epidemics spread rapidly. Millions of displaced people wandered aimlessly, including deportees returning from camps and Germans expelled from Poland and Czechoslovakia. The Allied occupation was immediate. Germany was divided into 4 zones: Soviet, American, British, and French. Berlin was similarly divided. The Nazi Party was banned, the SS dissolved, and the army disbanded. High-ranking officials were arrested. In the following months, the concentration camps were liberated one by one. Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Mauthausen. Images of skeletal prisoners circulated around the world. The Allies initiated denazification, a bureaucratic and judicial purge aimed at eliminating all structures of the regime. Thousands were arrested. Others committed suicide. Prisons and courts were filled with former high-ranking officials, civil servants, and officers. The Nuremberg trials began in November 1945. 24 leaders of the regime were tried for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Among them were Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, and Kaltenbrunner. The seized documents revealed the scale of the extermination system. The justification of obeying orders was rejected. 12 were sentenced to death. The trial marked the legal end of the Third Reich and the beginning of a new era in European history. Meanwhile, Germany faced material and human collapse. Power lines were destroyed, agricultural production paralyzed, and cities reduced to rubble. More than 20 million people were homeless. Women rebuilt streets, carried bricks, and buried corpses. Children survived in ruins or in makeshift orphanages. The occupying forces established local administrations under military control. By 1946, industrial production had barely reached 1/3 of its pre-war level. In the following years, the country's political division became entrenched. In 1949, the Western zones united under the Federal Republic of Germany with its capital in Bonn. The Eastern Zone became the German Democratic Republic under Soviet control. The Reich vanished from the map for good. The nation that had sought to dominate Europe was now divided in two: occupied, monitored, and subjugated. The ruins of the Reich: famine, division, and reconstruction. In the summer of 1945, Germany was a land of shadows. The figures were so extreme they seemed unreal. A third of the men born between 1915 and 1924 were dead or missing. Among those born between 1920 and 1925, the losses reached 40%. 11 million German prisoners of war waited in makeshift camps. Another 9 million displaced civilians tried to return to cities reduced to rubble. Added to this was a human tide of more than 14 million ethnic Germans expelled from the East, of whom more than 1.5 million would die during the exodus. The streets were piles of stone and bodies, the hospitals caves of starvation. The nation that had aspired to rule Europe was crawling amidst ruins. The winter of 1945 to 46 was the harshest of the century. More than 3.8 million homes were destroyed. In cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Cologne, more than half of the housing stock had vanished. Entire families survived in blackened basements without doors or windows, heating themselves with wood salvaged from the rubble. The women of the rubble, the Trümmerfrauen, became a symbol of civil resistance. With shovels and buckets, they formed human chains to remove bricks, clean streets, and build makeshift walls. They did it not out of heroism, but out of instinct. Reconstruction was the only way to maintain their sanity. Hunger was the common enemy. In June 1945, General Lucius D. Clay warned that some cold and hunger will be necessary for the German people to understand the consequences of the war they caused. But he insisted that mass famine should not be allowed. Despite imports from America, rations in the Western zones fell below 1,000 calories a day. Children were born underweight. Infectious diseases doubled. Money had lost its value. The black market dominated the cities. Women bartered watches for bread, coats for cigarettes. Idle locomotives lined the platforms. Coal, the foundation of any modern economy, had plummeted by 80%. Germany was surviving on the brink of starvation. The victor's hatred was also palpable. Signs along the Dutch border roads proclaimed, "Here ends the civilized world." Distrust was absolute. Denazification, which in theory was meant to purge society of the former regime, became a chaotic and uneven process. In the Soviet zone, tens of thousands of former Nazi Party members were executed or sent to camps. In the West, some 200,000 suspects were arrested. Millions had to register with the new authorities. The initial purges dissolved half the civil service, though it was soon understood that the country could not function without them. Within a few years, many reappeared in the administration under different titles. The Nuremberg trials symbolized international justice, but they also left an entire country grappling with its past. Germany had become a moral and political pariah. The division of the territory sealed the fate of the Reich. 4 occupation zones administered by the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union drew the borders of the new order. Berlin, still smouldering, was divided into 4 sectors. In the east, the Soviets dismantled nearly 30% of the industrial capital and sent it to the USSR as reparations. In the west, the priority was to stabilize the economy and prevent a communist revolution. Ideological differences among the Allies soon emerged. By 1947, Washington understood that without German recovery, there would be no stability in Europe. The Marshall Plan included West Germany in its reconstruction program. It was a bitter irony. Those who had promised to leave no stone unturned ended up financing the resurrection of their defeated enemy. Meanwhile, German society was changing from the ruins. Militarism, which had defined its identity for over a century, dissolved. Disarmament was total. The army disappeared and arms factories were closed or repurposed. Schools began to teach democracy, freedom, and human rights with the same fervour with which they had taught obedience and discipline. Universities established chairs of political and social sciences. In cinemas and classrooms, documentaries about the crimes of Nazism were shown. By 1948, the words freedom and democracy were heard everywhere, even though the country was still occupied. Re-education was slow but effective. Young people grew up under the tutelage of the victors. In the East, history took a different turn. The Soviet administration imposed a planned economy, nationalized industry, and established rigid political control. In 1949, the German Democratic Republic was founded. That same year, the Western zones formed the Federal Republic of Germany with its capital in Bonn. Two Germanys emerged from the same collapse. The physical wall did not yet exist, but the ideological wall already divided the continent. In the West, democracy was consolidated under Konrad Adenauer, who integrated the country into NATO and the European coal and steel community. In the East, political repression and censorship replaced Nazi propaganda with communist propaganda. From the ashes of the Reich arose two opposing states, each a reflection of the emerging bipolar world. The material recovery was as rapid as it was unexpected. Between 1948 and 1950, thanks to monetary reform and international aid, the Western economy was revived. The German miracle, Wirtschaftswunder, transformed rubble into factories and avenues. Hamburg resumed exports, the Ruhr resumed steel production, and the streets filled with vehicles. The memory of hunger lingered, but the country was moving toward a prosperity that only a decade earlier would have seemed impossible. The reconstruction was also psychological. The population adopted a collective silence about the war. The word guilt was avoided. Forgetting became a method of survival. In Berlin, however, the past remained visible. Between 1945 and 1948, residents scavenged through the ruins, searching for utensils, bricks, or simply any sign of life. In the days following the surrender, the Soviets organized soup kitchens, distributed coffee and soup, and even small gifts. Many Berliners, fearing retaliation from the Red Army, were surprised by the humane attitude of some soldiers. "The enemy is human after all," wrote one young man after receiving a cigarette from a Russian soldier. Even so, the tension was constant. Women were afraid to go out alone. Young men were arrested as prisoners. Looting, abuse, and despair mingled with the relief of having survived. Hunger and uncertainty defined daily life. But so did a new feeling, the end of the nightmare. The country that in 1940 had been on the verge of dominating Europe now had to learn to obey. Its cities were graveyards. Its population was sick. Its identity shattered. Germany had tried to build an empire and ended up as the most heavily surveilled territory on Earth. In less than 6 years, it had gone from the dizzying heights of absolute power to utter dependence. But from that ruin emerged something that neither Hitler nor the Allies had foreseen. A new nation, resigned, pragmatic, and forward-looking. In the spring of 1945, the map of Europe was redrawn upon the ruins of the Reich. The war that had begun with lightning ended in a slow agony of hunger and silence. Germany, which had come close to continental hegemony, was destroyed by its own ambition. No enemy army conquered it as much as its overconfidence defeated it. The Blitzkrieg, which had seemed invincible, drowned in the Russian mud and the rubble of Berlin. The Europe that emerged afterward was not the one Hitler dreamed of, but the one he made possible by destroying the previous one. A Europe united by the fear of repeating his madness. Between 1939 and 1945, Germany came closer than any other power to dominating the continent. but its victory would have been, as was its defeat, the ruin of everything. And in that paradox, having been so close to triumph and to the abyss at the same time, lies the true measure of its fall.